So that's all well and good, right? We can take a collection, pass it into the view, render out that collection. Do a simple loop over the model property, pull out those values. So let's kind of kick it up a notch. Let's make it a slightly more complex view model. So instead of passing in an array of strings, let's pass a list of user manager view model. So I'll get back to that in a second. I changed my model at the top, but let's flip back to the action first. So from in here, what I want to do is instead of just selecting one thing, I want to select a whole bunch of things. Now, in order for you to select multiple properties of a DTO, to be able to select multiple properties from this data source, you actually have to either load it into another class or use an anonymous type. So those anonymous types we talked about before briefly, that whole new curly bracket thing. So I could do something like this where new email address, x.firstname, x.lastname, x.username. You don't have to type that if you're trying to keep up. So what this does is it creates some random class that has these 4 properties and then pumps the values into that. And that works great if you're going to do something with this. The problem is that anonymous types don't live beyond the function that they were defined in. You can't pass them as a parameter. You can't pack them into something. They pretty much are there as a utility for you to do something with. And when you can pass them, I should take that back. You can pass them, but when you do, you pass them as an object. There's no, this is this type. It's just an object. So unless you're doing something special using reflection and dynamically looking at it and doing something with it, it's pretty much useless, and you're probably killing yourself having to reflect over objects all the time. You may as well make a class. Yeah.
Can you like label them as like different types? Then like put email address that equals x.
Well, they're kind of inferred because email address is already a string. So that those types are understood. It's this new with no type name. It basically the compiler goes through and it says, oh, I have this type with these 4 properties, so it actually in the background creates a class for you, gives it some random name, just picks some letters and numbers and shoves them together, and then every time this is called, it says create a new blah, and then set these properties. So it's kind of an inferred class, is another way to think of it. It's inferring the class based on the structure of that type, that anonymous type. What you can do, though, is you can use explicit typing. You can actually create a class, and then instead of just saying new something magical, you can say new this type, and then do it. So let's go ahead and do that instead, because we have a view model that is a strongly typed instance that we actually can do something with. So let me clean up the formatting a little bit. And basically we'll say new user manager view model. Let me run my compiler just to make sure. Oh. This needs to be user VM to list. Oh. Okay. So that's what I thought the case was. I just needed to verify. So what we need to do here is we have to explicitly call these mappings out so that the compiler understands which property goes to which thing. So to do that, instead of declaring a new instance and then doing all that work, we can just use that shorthand notation for initializing. So email address is a property of the user manager view model. So we're saying the email address property equals x.emailaddress. The first name property equals x.firstname, x being one of the rows from the database. So essentially this becomes a mapping of, let's map the email address column into the email address property of a user view model object. So we're creating a user view model, we're copying values from those data columns into that object. And then once all of that is done, we take the results of that collection, and we're turning it into a list of user view models. So that's what the toList is. Without calling toList, I won't get into too much detail. Without calling toList, you end up with a iQueryable data type that is a collection of user view models. And the iQueryable allows you to do things like the select and the where and all of those things. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, this entire function of work up to the toList, just before it, never actually executes until you call the toList or you wrap that whole thing inside of a for loop. Because that iQueryable is designed to dynamically build your SQL statement. And then when you finally either enumerate over it by putting it inside of a loop, or you call something like a toList or toArray, that doesn't cause that SQL query to execute until you do those things. So you can actually keep building onto this query set saying select this, where this, order by this, da 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 da. And that all gets basically bound into a giant select statement to be run against the SQL server. So they call that lazy execution, and basically it's there to allow you to dynamically adjust and change that query based on the logic of your app, and then wait to the last possible minute to open that database connection and run that query, get those results back, and then actually do work. The flip side is sometimes you may end up declaring an array, or a variable outside of the using statement. You'll write this beautiful select and where and all this stuff, and then the last step is that you want to return it outside of the using statement. Well, because you fell outside of the using statement, your DB context that holds your database connection, it gets thrown away. So when that query object tries to go back and actually run the query, the database connection is gone. And you may run into that in your code if you're not careful about making sure that you're doing things like toList or toArray. I've done it. I still do it today. I get ahead of myself, or I make some sort of change and go, oh, this will be great, and then I totally forget that I need to actually serialize my data, which is that running of the query, and then I pass a query object back to my view, and my view goes, I have no data, I don't know what you're talking about. So you may run into that. And usually the easiest fix is to call something like a toList or toArray. Make sure that that data is actually pulled from the database and loaded into memory before you go on to the next step. All right. If you want, once I'm done here, I can show you what that looks like, if that sounds a little abstract. All right. All right, so we no longer need this. And now we're going to pass our user VM to our view.